So I just finished the section on teleology as a regulative principle. There's a footnote about Kant saying that life was self-organizing and purposeful, but only because the human mind was unable to describe it in any other way. The footnote reads, in his last philosophical text, the Opus Posthumum, Kant realized that his thinking on this matter was incomplete. Varela, after Jonas, argues that, quote, without invalidating the a priori categories that had been the possibility of all knowledge, Kant finds an entirely new foundation for them, the lived body. The moving forces of matter, prime subject of natural science, are not deduced from or dictated by the a priori categories of reason, but themselves are a basic experience underlying all a priori categories. Thus, end quote, thus we know an organism is intrinsically purposeful and self-organizing because we extrapolate as much from our own experience as organisms. On to section B, autopoiesis, teleology as constitutive. Quote, autopoiesis proposes an understanding of the radical transition to the existence of an individual, a relation of an organism with itself, and the origin of concern, based on its ongoing self-produced identity. End quote. Francisco J. Varela. The application of Aristotelian teleology in modern biology is a matter of great controversy. Some biologists, such as Richard Dawkins, deride any mention of it, as natural selection is deemed to have explained away any requirement of a purpose or aim behind the purely mechanical process of evolution. But for reasons we have mentioned above, this view can be easily dispensed with, as Darwin's theory concerned phylogenetic change, having nothing to say whatsoever about the self-organization and goal-directed behavior of the individual organism. Indeed, Darwin's mechanism of natural selection is applicable only given an already self-organizing creature intentionally operating and reproducing within an environment. Other biologists have adopted a new term, teleonomy, to describe the as-if property of purposes evident in the behavior and organizational dynamics of life. Biologist Jacques Monod goes so far as to say, it is indispensable, quote, it is indispensable to recognize that teleonomy is essential to the very definition of living beings. Here he echoes Kant by pointing out that life cannot be understood without purposes, though also like Kant, he reduces these purposes to be he understands these purposes to be a projection of the human observer. This is as far as most biologists are willing to go, as they feel obliged to respect the conceptual boundaries of the mechanistic paradigm. It is worth noting, however, that no biological science has been able to express itself apart from phraseology which is meaningless unless it refers to ideals proper to the organism in question. That was actually a quote from Whitehead from Processing Reality. Whitehead goes on to credit Aristotle with having impressed this fact on the science of biology, and describes how this overstressing of final causation during the Christian medieval period resulted in the equally overstressed reliance on efficient causation in modern science. When Varela and Humberto Maturana originally developed the theory of autopoiesis, they were undoubtedly influenced by this scientific tendency to overstress efficient causes. Living systems as physical autopoietic machines are purposeless systems. Quote, that was a quote from Maturana and Varela. By machine, they did not intend to confuse organisms with artifacts, but meant that the system was determined by its structure and organization. Any purposes attributed to it were considered projections, regulative as opposed to constitutive features. In one of the essays he authored, however, Varela proposed a revision. In one of the last essays he authored, however, Varela proposed a revision of the understanding of purposes present in his earlier work with Maturana, who incidentally does not share Varela's change of heart. He came to see that the autopoietic organization of the living implies the emergence of an autonomous center of concern capable of providing an interior perspective. End quote. To understand why, we must explore in more detail the theory of autopoiesis. Quote, an autopoietic system, the minimal living organization, is one that continuously produces the components that specify it, while at the same time realizing it, the system, as a concrete unity in space and time, which makes the network of production of components possible. End quote. To understand this rather abstract definition, let us ground it in the paradigm case from which it is drawn, the cell. The living cell is engaged in a continual process of self-production and repair, wherein each of its organelles participate in the production of one another, as well as the membrane which defines them as a unity. Though an autopoietic system is also a self-organizing, dissipative structure, we should not reduce it to these categories. A dissipative structure is an energetically open system that emerges in non-equilibrium situations. The key difference between a dissipative structure and an autopoietic system is that the former usually does not produce a boundary that establishes it as a unity, nor does it organize the components on which it depends. Instead, it is largely dependent on its local environment and so lacks a degree of autonomy present in organisms. We should not reduce autopoietic systems to self-organizing dissipative structures. What distinguishes an autopoietic system is its self-produced identity, or quote, instauration of a point of view. An autopoietic entity is one that can be studied empirically from the outside, but that also requires one to appreciate the horizon of experience brought forth by its continual self-production from the inside. It is here that an immanent teleology finds its way back into biology, not as a regulative principle of our study of organisms, teleonomy, but as constitutive of them. Quote, self-production is already and inevitably a self-affirmation that shows the organism as involved in the fundamental purpose of maintaining its identity. Varela's analysis of the experiential component of autopoiesis involves more than just recognizing the identity arising due to the system's circular dynamics, but also the Umwelt produced by its, quote, sense-making, which allows it to, quote, change the physiochemical world into an environment of significance and valence, end quote, such that intentional behavior directed toward an end becomes possible. We can here recognize the attribution of both formal, the identity or idea actualized in the movement of the organism, and final, the end-directed behavior, causes of the organization of the living. But can the Kantian dilemma be so easily resolved? Kant, as we said earlier, did not understand how self-organization of the autopoietic variety could be possible naturalistically. In the last century, however, our understanding of the physiochemical makeup of organisms has increased significantly. We are far better equipped than Kant to cope with organic form. But how exactly does an autopoietic account of life establish that the activity of an organism is intrinsically purposeful? How do we know that a teleological element is behind life when it could just as well be a projection of our own, quote, perspective on an otherwise completely neutral behavior, end quote? Quote, it is actually by experience of our teleology, our wish to exist on as a subject, not our imputation of purposes on objects, that teleology becomes a real rather than an intellectual principle. Let me read that again. It is actually by experience of our teleology, our wish to exist further on as a subject, not our imputation of purposes on objects, that teleology becomes a real rather than an intellectual principle. Thus causality, as it is perceived by us as sentient beings, may be subsumed under the more general principle of life. End quote. That was Varela. Varela here inverts the whole tradition of natural philosophy since at least Descartes, by reminding us that, quote, before scientists we are first living beings, and as such we have the evidence of our intrinsic teleology in us, end quote. The mechanistic paradigm could begin only after Descartes had firmly established a fundamental separation between the thinking and extended substances. The whole Kantian difficulty over whether to apply teleology to the organisms themselves, or to recognize it as a principle of our own judgment, can be traced back to this division between mind and matter. Footnote, Descartes